A popular uprising that shook the country to its core. A defiant president under siege from his people. As the protesters took charge of the streets, we look back at the events that are changing Egypt.
I will stay on the air if I can until the police come
in a special program, Al Jazeera gives you a day-by-day account from those that witnessed them firsthand. Egypt burning, at this time on Al Jazeera.
Personal blogs by professional journalists. blogs.aljazeera.net. This is Al Jazeera.
Welcome to the News Hour. I'm Sami Zaidan from Al Jazeera News Centres here in Doha and in Washington, D.C. These are the world's top stories. Taking the fight to his own people, the embattled Libyan leader appeals to his supporters as his son appeals to the West.
I personally urge the Europeans to send fact-finding mission to Libya as soon as possible, because we are not afraid of facts.
But the protests continue, as does the crackdown. Pressure is also mounting on Muammar al-Gaddafi from outside of Libya.
I'm Daljit Dhaliwal in our America's Broadcast Center, where the international reaction steps up a gear.
Now is the time for decisive action.
In a draft resolution on Libya, the United Nations Security Council calls for an arms embargo, a travel boycott, and the freezing of regime assets abroad. Plus, Barack Obama says Libya's unrest poses an extraordinary threat to U.S. national security as the White House imposes sanctions.
Well, we begin this news hour with the fast-moving developments in Libya. Internal and international pressure is mounting on Muammar al-Gaddafi to stand down after 42 years in power. Well, as the protests continued for an 8th day, the Libyan leader himself turned up at a pro-government rally in the capital, Tripoli, defiant as ever, promising to fight and defend his position. But the anti-Gaddafi demonstrators haven't backed down either. Some of them faced another violent crackdown, and there are reports of yet more deaths. All this prompting an impassioned plea at the UN by the Libyan ambassador there for the killings to stop. An appeal echoed by the UN chief himself. Well, NATO and the US have said they'll slap arms embargoes, travel bans and sanctions on Gaddafi's government, which of course is continuing to shrink. More of his own diplomats now say they no longer speak for the colonel and are siding with the protesters. Well, in the past hour, Gaddafi's son Saif has called on the European Union to send a fact-finding team to Libya. In a moment, we'll hear from our correspondents inside Libya, who are not naming for our own safety. But first, Nadeem Baba has this report.
Denouncing the man whose forces they ran out of town. In Libya's eastern city of Benghazi, calls for Muammar al-Gaddafi to be brought to justice.
We do not want him to flee to another country. We want to punish him because he shed Libyan blood. He killed our young people.
Earlier on in the capital Tripoli, there were violent scenes as security forces loyal to Gaddafi fired on protesters. Several people were reportedly killed. Following Friday prayers, pro-democracy demonstrators had converged on the capital from towns all around. After claiming protesters across the country are influenced by both al-Qaeda and hallucinogenic drugs, Libya's leader appeared in front of supporters in Green Square, insisting the population was behind him.
The Libyan people, if I'm not loved by my people, I don't deserve to live. If my people, the Arab and African peoples, and all peoples do not love Muammar al-Gaddafi does not deserve to live only for one day.
How much of this he believes is anyone's guess. Despite these pictures, Gaddafi officials admit large parts of Libya are now controlled by his opponents. But his son is now on a media offensive, telling invited journalists that Libya's armed forces have not attacked peaceful protesters.
I personally urge the Europeans to send fact-finding mission to Libya as soon as possible, because we are not afraid of facts. We are worried about rumors and lies.
To back him up, state television's been showing statements by army officers.
We are not fighting the youth because they're part of our people. We are only fighting the bandits. We had strict orders not to attack civilians, but to defend ourselves and minimize casualties. The pictures shown on media outlets, including AlJazeera, are old, and I challenge anyone to show any new pictures of violence against civilians.
All the while, the violence claims more victims. One protester sheltering with some of the injured in Tripoli described the scene to Al Jazeera.
Gunfiring is still heavily heard around us, and as I said, we are taking refuge with people we don't know and they don't know us. Other people are taken detained alive at gunpoint. Also hear the gunfiring and shooting around me. It is very heavy and intense.
Those who want Gaddafi gone may be feeling emboldened, but for now it seems he's digging in his heels. Nadeem Barber, Al Jazeera.
As soon as the Friday prayer ended, the banners were pulled out and the protest began. On the grounds of the mosque where several companions of the Prophet Muhammad are believed to be buried. And now they have been joined by 11 victims who died on February 17th, the fallen of this uprising. It's in their name that the demonstrations are continuing. The people want the fall of the regime, the same slogan that swept Tunisia and Egypt, now echoed across eastern Libya. And the same demands: basic rights, freedom and dignity. The pressure continuing to end 40 years of authoritarian rule by a leader they don't seem to be afraid of anymore. They can count on strong support from the army. Here, local commanders announcing that they are on the side of this popular revolt. The Libyan leader has more than once depicted protesters as drug addicts or supporters of Al-Qaeda. Gaddafi named Abdel Hakim al-Hassadi as the local leader of the group. In an exclusive interview to Al Jazeera, he denies these allegations.
When the uprising started and I saw there was an opportunity to change the regime, I decided to join. We have no further aims of establishing an Islamic emirate or anything else, but this is an excuse to scare people off.
In a separate demonstration, women are making their voices heard as well. They want a free Libya where their husbands, sons and fathers are safe.
Today, Libya is free. Today, Libya is free, and for all. I told him just one word: don't go out. Stay. We're gonna bring you and kill you as you killed our people. But there's no comeback. No comeback. Thank you.
For many protesters, this is the first time they dare to speak up. But it's certainly not the last one, for the sake of future generations.
Let's speak now to Ashraf Tulti. He's the Executive Director of Justice and Democracy for Libya. Joins us from Washington, D.C. As you probably saw in our package there, pictures of demonstrations, also reports of clashes in several districts of the capital. What is the situation in Tripoli right now? Who's in control?
It's escalating violence, unfortunately. We were thinking the still remaining government will manage the peaceful demonstrators and let them express their natural right of marching and asking for democracy and rule of law, which is their right. But unfortunately, an excessive usage of power, that is the dominating culture of the regime, and we keep listening and seeing and watching all those interventions and statements by the TV, by the regime, that the demonstrators are people who are taking narcotics, they are people who belong to Al-Qaeda, what have you.
We're talking about
the
those
entire world is
statements.
watching.
Gaddafi again spoke, this time threatening to turn Libya red with blood.
Yes, it is scary. It is really scary, and that's why we urge the UN to intervene. I mean, the situation, we know the regime, they do deliver when they threaten, so they're not playing games. The UN should intervene, should protect the Libyan people. The UN played a major role in the independence of Libya in 1951, and now Libya is in a stage which is really dangerous, and we really urge the UN to make a quick intervention by sending UN troops to arrest the head of the regime and his troops, mercenaries, which is another war against civilians, unarmed. Now, it is not Libyans with Libyans. There is a foreign intervention here, which is various nationalities of mercenaries, and this is another crime against humanity. So the UN cannot just watch and go through the usual bureaucracy. There are lives of innocent humans in the front line as we speak.
Well, his son is inviting the European Union to send in a fact-finding team. Would that be helpful? Is that something? Is it the right time for fact-finding?
Absolutely. There is no doubt. But the European Union should be as fast as sending vessels and airplanes to save their people. They should move tonight. And if they do that, they will totally empower the civil movement, which is a peaceful movement, and they're going to see it by themselves, document it, and maybe that would be the end of this violence. So the European Union should do that. They should not give it a second thought.
We'll be talking to you again later in the show. Thanks so much for your thoughts at this point. Well, people fleeing Libya have found sanctuary on the nearby island of Malta. A U.S. chartered ferry carrying around 300, mostly U.S. citizens, finally arrived in Valletta. Well, rough weather delayed the sailing from Tripoli for 2 days. Malta's hotels are already full of people who've fled Libya by air. Well, after the nearby island of Lampedusa was flooded by refugees after the revolution in Tunisia, Malta is bracing itself for another influx. Cal Perry has more from the island.
Now, over 300 civilians arriving here in the port of Malta, carrying with them stories from Tripoli. Most people said the fighting was worse at night. Everyone agreeing that the humanitarian situation is growing worse by the day, people having trouble finding basic things like food and water. Almost everybody who arrived here said that the boat trip was incredibly difficult. 2 days in port, followed by a 9-hour journey through very